Generally, when we talk about psychic phenomena, there are three basic kinds of things that can happen. One is that me as an individual, I might sort of get some information from out there. I might learn something by my intuition from the future or the past, or maybe what's happening over here on the other side of town. When I receive information like that passively, we have different names for that, like clairvoyance or precognition if it's coming from the future. And it means that I'm receiving something, and in the sense of psi phenomena, it means I'm receiving some information in a way that we don't understand. There's another way that phenomena happen in the realm of psychic phenomena, and that is, instead of me receiving some information, I might have some influence outside of myself. So I might have some influence on what we would call scientifically a system, something external. And when that happens, in that kind of scenario or context, we call that psychokinesis. The word meaning psycho from the spirit or the mind, kinesis meaning to move or to make something move. So psychokinesis in the history of parapsychology has different flavors. Okay. And the simplest one is what we sort of know from the movies, where something big happens that you can see. So I raise up out of my chair, or I make something move at a distance, or maybe I bend a spoon without touching it, just by my mental attention. And that's what we call macroscopic PK. And that's in the realm of sort of seeing is believing. When you see something happen, and you also see that you have no explanation of how that could have occurred other than the person's mental engagement with this system or thing. So that's one kind of PK, this macroscopic PK. It's the realm of miracles, isn't it? Yeah. Another kind that is a little more subtle is PK, influence on a system that's a living system. So this is typically a kind of a more subtle phenomena, and it's in the realm of healing. So we know stories from all of the religious traditions, but also from our own history here in Europe or elsewhere, that they're stories of people who can influence the living system of another human being. And there have been studies in parapsychology where you look at systems that might be plants or animals. And that kind of influence we call bio-PK. And then there's a third kind of PK that's even a little more subtle that we call micro-PK. And that's, I think, what we're going to be talking about here today. And the micro-PK is on an even smaller scale, where the way it starts to be a little bit scientific in the language, but the way we explain it is that we have systems that have some kind of random behavior, that are somehow vibrating or agitated. And the mental intention of a person attending them, watching them, and willing for something to happen slightly, in a small way, alters the behavior of the system. So let me give an example that could make that a little clear. And maybe the easiest example to think about is going into a casino, where you're going to roll a die, right? And you're going to roll a die, and you imagine, in fact, you know that everybody who rolls a die in a casino wishes for an outcome. What we mean by micro-PK is that you actually really influence the outcome of the die falling. Not in the way that you get what you want every time, but on average, over the course of time, you get a little bit of an advantage in your favor. And so when we have random systems like flipping a coin, throwing a die, and in the laboratory we use more sophisticated electronic systems that are basically the same thing, vibrating randomly in some way, electronically or physically. And the micro-PK is that The hypothesis is that you can influence very slightly the behavior of that system in one way or another. So now to do these kind of experiments, there are a couple of elements that we bring in together. One is that we have our system that we're going to study. So for convenience in the laboratory, very often we use what is called a random number generator, which is kind of a big mouthful, but what it means is it's an electronic circuit that can produce bits, that is ones and zeros, basically numbers, but in a random way. So the typical random number generator that we use is an electronic circuit that's based underneath on quantum fluctuations inside elements in the circuit and produces data that we can collect, which comes out in the form of a 1 or a 0. So this is very much like flipping a coin where you would have heads or tails, but by doing this electronically, we have a lot more control over the system. So that's one element, is we have a random system, which could be a random number generator or a coin. The second element is that we have a person who is introduced to this system, and we ask that person to try and influence it. How are they supposed to influence it? Any way that they intuit or feel would work. So just like the gambler, who is going to have his own way of influencing the dice, a subject who joins this experiment is introduced to this little system, and they might get a picture of how the system is behaving on a computer screen, some line wiggling or something. And we ask that person, simply by your mental intention, any way you feel comfortable, wish, will, hope, push that this system will go in one direction or another. The basis for drawing any conclusions from these experiments is statistics. And for statistics to be valid, or as we say, to be a valid basis for inferring a conclusion, what we need is lots and lots of data. So when we're looking at very small effects, it is true that if you just do an experiment once or twice, or for a very short period, you cannot distinguish between your outcome and whether it was due to chance or whether it looks like something beyond chance. So lots and lots of data with lots and lots of subjects is usually required when you have these very small effects. So let me give you an example. So suppose I were to say, let's do an experiment with a coin flip, and I want to ask you to wish that you get a head, and we flip the coin and you get a head. Now, was that luck? Or was that your influence on the coin? Well, we don't know. Now suppose we do that 100 times, and you get 50 times you get head and 50 times you get tails. We might say, well, nothing much happened. However, if you got 60 times heads and 40 times tails, then we might wonder, is that beyond what we would expect just by chance? And there's a way mathematically to determine just how likely or unlikely a result was from a given experiment. Typically, when we do these experiments, I would ask you to try it first to get more heads. And then we would come back and sit down and do it the opposite way, where I would say, try to get more tails. And we would compare. Do you get more heads when you're willing for heads? Do you get more tails when you want tails? That's another way that we can distinguish between pure luck and whether there's some other effect happening that we need to explain. And lastly, what we do, and this takes a lot of extra time in performing all of these experiments, is you test the equipment without anybody present to make sure that when no one is around, that the random behavior is just what you would expect without any biases or imperfections in the equipment that you're using. some of the critiques were valid and others were less so. But the more interesting ones were the valid critiques, which are basically the following. You're measuring an extremely small effect. Therefore, your equipment has to be extremely well calibrated in order to be sure that there aren't inherent biases already in the system, whether somebody is present or not. And someone could criticize that those calibrations weren't sufficient. Now, if you go back and look at the Princeton engineering results, they were good engineers and their systems were extremely well calibrated and stable over long, long periods of time. So there was debate, but in the end, the quality of the work that was done was sufficient for a number of people to be mollified that those critiques were not valid. Other critiques that are perhaps not as interesting are critiques that just write off the whole possibility of psychic phenomena. So this would be similar to somebody saying, I just think it's impossible that there could be life on other planets. Therefore, any evidence that you bring that there is must be wrong. Was started by a group of researchers who had been doing micro-PK research with random number generators for some years. These typical experiments where somebody sits in front of a random number generator and intends to bias their behavior. One thing that they noticed that seemed curious is that sometimes the random number generators seem to exhibit an unusual behavior, not when somebody was actually sitting in front of them, but when there was something going on, maybe a party or a group or a meeting off to the side. That is, when some kind of engagement among people was happening, but it wasn't directed at the random number generator itself. So the question came up, could it be that if this micro-PK effect is real, that it doesn't require that somebody actually sort of direct their intention at it, but just the fact that in the air there's some kind of conscious engagement that's happening among people, for example, that maybe that might set up some kind of field or something that couples to the random number generators and affects their behavior. So this was something that first came out of the laboratory lore as a possibility and then was put to experiment. And so there was a series of experiments that they called field RNG work, where they took portable random number generators outside the laboratory to gatherings of people. So this might be a football match or a concert or some large gathering or celebration or something, and let the random number generators just run by themselves in the presence of a large group of people doing something that's collective and engaging. And those experiments seemed to show that something was happening, although they weren't repeated carefully enough as the former micro-PK experiments were to be really convincing. But what they did do was inspire a certain number of researchers to think, well, maybe this is something that we should pursue. And these field experiments, the way they were done, is that the equipment was brought to a venue where people were gathered, and the people knew absolutely nothing about this experiment taking place. But the equipment was brought quietly off to the side, and blind to the experiment, the people continued with their celebration or their football match or whatever, and the data were collected and then brought back to the laboratory and analyzed. So the notion here was that the very presence of people interacting consciously with each other would create a field in the environment that could affect the random number generators. So these are very, very different experiments where the actual subjects are groups of people who don't even know the experiment is taking place. And in the late 90s, a number of the researchers began to put their random number generators in their laboratories together in a network. So there were people in Europe, there were people in America, and they started out with a small number of random number generators and let them run and collect data. And then they waited for something to happen in the world that would galvanize the attention of many, many people. And this was about the time of the tragic accident of Lady Diana in Paris. And so they had a nascent network of random number generators that was running in the background around that time, and they were able to collect data and analyze the data that happened before and then after the world learned of the death of Lady Diana in the tunnel under the bridge in Paris. So those data were analyzed, and what the analysis showed is that in the hours after the accident, as the word spread, that the fluctuations in the randomness of the data grew. And that was taken as a sign that there was some kind of perturbation on the stability of the system of the random number generators in the network. Shortly after that, there was a decision made to make this into a formal experiment. So the data that were collected from Lady Diana's death were not sufficient or well enough calibrated to be scientifically valid, but they were interesting enough to motivate a proper experiment, and that was the beginning of the Global Consciousness Project. The Global Consciousness Project established a network of random number generators around the world, beginning in 1998, just about when the internet was coming online, which made this technically feasible. And they began with a dozen or so random number generators that were online, and these would collect data 24/7, send the random data over the internet to a server in Princeton, New Jersey, that would archive all of the data coming in from the network. The proposal of the experiment was, with this accumulating database, to simply wait until events in the world that seemed to sort of shake the human psyche, or at least get our attention, happened, and then to analyze the data before that happened, which would be the control data, and then look at how the data changed shortly thereafter. I became involved in this experiment right after the 9/11 attacks in New York. So I'm American, and I grew up outside of New York. And when the 9/11 attacks happened, I, like many of us, was shocked, but also, since I was aware of this young Global Consciousness Project, I contacted Roger Nelson, who was the project director in Princeton, and a couple of others involved in parapsychology also got in touch with him, and we said we would like to see what the data looks like. And from that, we began a long analysis of the data associated with 9/11, and it did appear that there was a change. We have a random number generator, which is a little electronic device, and it gets plugged into a computer somewhere. And this computer is connected to the internet, and the computer uploads this data, which is just random numbers, these ones and zeros that we've talked about, uploads it with the time that the data were created, and sends it to Princeton. In the network that was created by the Global Consciousness Project, there were dozens and dozens of these random number generators on different computers around the world. So, for example, there was one on a computer in Princeton, New Jersey. There was another one on a computer in Paris, France. There was one on a computer in Tokyo, and so on, spanning the whole globe. At its maximum, there were 60 or 70 generators on computers all over the world, generating data synchronized, simultaneously, uploading the data and sending them to Princeton. So streams of data from different random number generators were coming in, and what the experiment would look at would be, would the variations in these random numbers dance together? Would there be a synchronicity or a correlation between the data at those times when large populations of people in the world are reacting to something in an emotional or highly engaging way? The basic hypothesis is that when we react together in a way, it creates an extensive field that infiltrates the behavior of the random number generators, and the only way we can see it is if the random number generators synchronize a little bit, correlate a little bit. So you know, if you look at a football match and you see all the fans who are jumping up and down, and it's not much is there except you just see the fans, but then there is this game where they make a wave and everybody stands up. And when they make a wave of people standing and sitting and standing and sitting around, it's very, very easy to see. When they make the wave, what they're doing is they're correlating with each other. I stand up when you stand up. The Global Consciousness Project was measuring something similar to that. So this was a way of drawing a very weak signal out of very noisy data, is to look for correlations between the random number generators. Now, in terms of the numbers and the data, what you would typically see is what looks like a squiggly line that at some point begins to move upward, which would be the sign of this correlation increasing over time. And the hypothesis was that this would happen for short periods, meaning an hour or two, during a football match that's a World Cup final, or during a particularly moving funeral of the Pope that draw the attention of 1 billion people, and so on. So now the beauty of the Global Consciousness Project is that it would test major world events from time to time. And the way the project ran, that would be maybe once, twice, 3 times a month. The rest of the time, the data was still being collected, but there was no particular event of significance. So all the data that happened in between these short episodic events act as a control. That's kind of the baseline. And the way that it was convincing that the data show some kind of anomalous effect was that it was only during the designated events that the data would deviate. And the rest of the time, you can see the data, it's flat. I think in the end, the implication of the Psi research is very, very personal, because it's telling us something about not only who we are, or maybe who we are not, but it's also telling us something about what the world is, or what the world is not. And it's putting us together in this world that is at the same time uncertain, but perhaps far more playful labile and alive than we might have imagined. And the fact that this comes through science doesn't make it dull or boring. What it means is it means that we can look at this deeply with deep questions and actually convince ourselves that it is so, and also we don't know what it fully means. But it's an invitation for us to look at our place in this world that sort of dances about us. Well, I think one thing about the scientific research into psi phenomena is that there's little else in science that is as fascinating as this. It goes deeply to questions of what is consciousness, who we are, and what is our world and our connection with it. The psi research also is a call to other researchers to look at this and to help us understand it, because any kind of understanding or theory of psi is going to require input from all of the sciences, because it basically includes everything from our physiology, consciousness, the physical world about us. So it certainly is a sort of a call to intellectual inquiry that is, as on a par with questions of whether there's life outside of this planet, and what is the origin of the universe. It's also what is the sense for us individually of having a mind that has no locus in our body necessarily, and that the sense that my mind is only here could be some kind of half-truth or illusion. And if that veil, of illusion falls away, then what do we see? So it becomes very, very personal and also quite thrilling to think that we could live our lives with a world that is as sort of as playful as this is. In the meditative traditions, in basically all the meditative traditions, psi comes along with meditation practice. So if there is a training in mindfulness and also awareness, and in how you can bring those two together, then whether it's Buddhist or Hindu or other traditions, what is said in the text is that abilities like clairvoyance, clairaudition, psychokinetic abilities, and others just naturally arise. They're some kind of byproduct of the mind becoming more settled, more focused, stronger, more pliable. And that it's sort of like a byproduct in the sense that, in these traditions, it's almost mundane. Like if you live well and eat well and sleep well, your skin will be healthy and glow. If you meditate well and are clear in your focus and able to bring things together in the mind in a stable way, then you will be able to hear from afar or have a little glimmer of the future. And these traditions say that these things are not mastered, but they arise. So in the meditative traditions, they acknowledge that many people have inherent abilities, just like some athletes are better than others, but that we all can have access to these abilities if we train the mind. So some may have a stronger ability than others, but that in principle it's accessible to each one of us, because that's what it is to be a human, to have this kind of ability. The literature and the experiments in parapsychology over all these decades makes that very, very clear. And there's some striking cases where experiments were done that showed an effect, where there were very, very many people who participated, and it was considered that everybody was participating a little bit, but on a sharper analysis you find that there was just one or two people that were giving the whole effect. And this we see in the literature over and over again. So yes, just like in athletics, just like in musical ability, just like in mathematical ability, there's a small population of people sort of out on the tail of the distribution who are the ones who can reliably and in a strong fashion produce these extraordinary effects. Now, whether or not each one of us has a little bit of this ability, I believe we probably do. But in order to demonstrate that scientifically is much, much more expensive, time-consuming, and takes much, much more effort, simply because it's such a small effect when you look at average people like yourself or myself. So one of the curious things in the psi effects is that there are many different kinds, and people who are very good at one particular kind of psi effect might not be good at another one, just as our athlete who ran the 100-meter dash might not be good at running the marathon. So it varies quite a bit from person to person and from effect to effect. The difficulty in replicating experiments, particularly experiments that involve human beings, so this pertains to medicine, this pertains to psychology and to parapsychology, is that it's very difficult to know what all of the conditions are in a given experiment, because we're complex human beings. And since we're talking about internal mental states of ourselves in these experiments, we do not know exactly how to reproduce the exact mental state in a successful experiment. So that just means that there's a lot of variability in the experiments. And if one allows that sometimes an experiment will work and sometimes it won't work, but in the long run, if I do enough different experiments that are similar enough, I will find that on average the effect reproduces. And so that's the way that generally that we would approach reproducibility in parapsychology, as you would in medicine or in psychology experiments. Within parapsychology, there is some debate about whether or not experiments can be reproduced. Okay. They can, and there is the data to show that. The reason that there is a debate, however, is that we're talking about an ability, a human ability, that is so subtle and rare that it is difficult to reproduce it. So an example would be a superior athletic performance or a superior musical rendition. Every now and then there's something that is extraordinary. If you break the world record in the 100-meter run, and then I ask you, say, okay, reproduce that now, well, we know that's not going to happen, because so many subtle circumstances and conditions had to come together for that runner to be to perform that well, that we don't know how to reproduce it. And even if we did, we wouldn't know how to enforce it in that individual athlete. So this situation is a little bit similar in parapsychology experiments. Nevertheless, there are some very particular experiments, there's a name for it, the Bancel experiments, where the reproducibility is established. And some parapsychologists who argue for there not being a replicable experiment will typically ignore those data and focus on more complicated situations where it is difficult to reproduce things. But in fact, we do have some paradigms, some protocols that they're arduous, they take a long time to accumulate the data, but over the 30 or 40 years that those experiments have been done, it's very, very clear that they reproduce.